What about capping production? If they don't clean up the mess, then let's cap production. Let's shut her down, eh?
Yes.
Yeah!
Thanks, Rudy. But first, before I start, get rid of my garbage. I mean, why should I take responsibility for my garbage? We just leave it here. So, I'm Peter Loney from Edmonton Chapter Council of Canadians, and thank you, Breezy, for organizing this event. Breezy is a good member of our group, and this is a chapter event. So we're here to tell the oil and gas companies that they need to clean up their messes. And the messes we're talking about are orphaned and abandoned wells and the tailings up in the Fort McMurray Athabasca River area. And those are huge, both of those are huge liabilities, and they're causing pollution on a daily basis all the time. Now, we know that cleanup is part of any process, but of course, big companies, the cleanup part doesn't really contribute to production. So it's just a cost to them, and any way they can get out of it, they'll try to get out of it. Various ways, punt it down the road, and of course that's why we have the orphaned wells, because if you wait long enough, you go bankrupt, and then the public sector have the responsibility. And if you get subsidies to do it, well, that's great too. And as Breezy said, both under federal and provincial legislation, they have the responsibility to clean up their messes. So it's we're not asking something that they're not supposed to do. But the problem is the messes get bigger faster than the cleanup takes place. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the tailings. That's the issue that we've gotten involved with. And, well, they're big, cover over 300 square kilometers, and that is like Edmonton from the White Mud to the Yellowhead, and 50th Street, 50th Street to West Edmonton Mall, which would put us right in the middle right now. As of 2020, the volume was 1.4 trillion liters. Of course, they contaminate the land and the rivers and affect the animals and the people. And the communities most affected are the First Nations communities. So they're the ones that have been really leading the struggle to get to deal with the issue of the tailings ponds. Now, I'm going to say something about recent history and how we got involved. A couple of years ago, under pressure from the Alberta government and industry, the federal government proposed changing regulations to allow the companies to dump treated tailings water into the Athabasca River. And First Nations and environmental groups opposed this, first of all, because the Indigenous groups had not and have not given free, prior, and informed consent. And also the technologies available are really not, they clean up the water to a certain extent, but not good enough, not good enough. So Christina, who's right in front, talked to Richard, who's out in the Kootenay, so he's not here, and convinced him and us to put on 3 symposia. And we did this with Keepers of the Water. Now, Keepers is an Indigenous-led group whose focus is on the rivers and land and animals in the area of the rivers that flow into the Arctic, and that includes the Athabasca River. So we worked with them and had 3 great events with wonderful speakers, many of them provided by Keepers of the Water. And then we had some discussion groups after that. And so even though we've gotten involved in other issues, we haven't let up on this one, and that's part of the reason why we're here. Now, subsequent to that, it was revealed in February of this year that I'll just go back. In May of 2022, Alberta Energy Regulator and Imperial Oil discovered that there was a significant leak coming from the Kearl mine. And gee whiz, even though they were meeting with Indigenous groups pretty well continually over the next 9 months, they didn't think to tell them about this problem. And then in February of this year, there was a big spill of, I think, 4.3 million.
5.3, they say.
How much?
5.3.
Yeah, 5.3 million liters into the land, the surrounding land, and of course that eventually gets into the river. And then it was revealed. And of course, people were pretty mad about it. And what I want to do now is I want to read you a letter that was written to both governments about this issue in May of 2023. Dear Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Premier Danielle Smith, we, the undersigned organizations and individuals, are writing to express our deep concerns about the irresponsible management of toxic wastewater in the tar sands tailings ponds, which now store over 1.4 trillion liters of toxic fluids. We are particularly alarmed by the rapid growth of and ongoing seepage from the tailings ponds, which have resulted in contamination of rivers, groundwater, air, and surrounding boreal forests, as well as subsequent exposure to toxins for wildlife and in downstream Indigenous nations. The adverse impacts of tailings process affected water on downstream environment and food chain are well documented. Despite repeated calls for downstream human health studies in the context of the increasing burden of illness and cancer, including rare cancers, no significant investigation has taken place. Imperial Oil's recent leak and spill, which allowed an unknown volume of tailings to seep into the muskeg and over 5.3 million liters of toxic wastewater to spill from its Kearl facility into the environment, is a disaster. It is unacceptable that downstream Indigenous nations, including the Athabasca Chippewayan First Nation and Mikisew Cree First Nation, were kept in the dark about the leak for 9 months. The disaster exemplifies the dangers the toxic tailings pose to communities' entire ecosystems. It brings into stark view the failure of tar sands operators to responsibly manage their waste. Tailings ponds have been leaking millions of liters of toxic fluid for decades. Indigenous nations downstream of the tar sands are experiencing high rates of cancers, respiratory diseases, and other adverse health effects. Tailings ponds violate the nation's inherent and treaty rights, including those of harvesting foods and medicine from their territories and practicing land-based ceremonies due to the contamination of lands, water, air, animals, and plants. The Imperial Oil disaster is not an isolated incident. It is the latest example of a systemic failure by Canada and Alberta to hold companies accountable for their obligations towards downstream Indigenous nations and the environment. Additionally, Alberta Energy Regulator's response to the incidents at Imperial's Kearl mine demonstrates a fundamental disregard for its mandate to ensure oil sands operators do not compromise human health or the health and safety of the environment. Governments must step up and use their jurisdictional power to protect health and the environment. So I'm going to read the demands because they haven't changed. In the immediate term, we demand the government of Alberta and Canada require Imperial to seal their berm to prevent leakage of seepage off-site, shut down production at Imperial Oil Kearl facility, establish a process to ensure all impacted Indigenous nations free, prior, and informed consent is required before Imperial Oil can restart production based on proof their industrial wastewater is not reaching or at risk of reaching the environment. Remove barriers to Indigenous nations' access to compliance reporting data and sites for environmental sample collection for all tar sands projects and provide capacity funding for a detailed review. Implement a downstream testing program that continues after the spring thaw. Charge Imperial Oil and other tar sands operators who tailings ponds are leaking under the Federal Fisheries Act and relevant sections of the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act. Provide funding for a comprehensive and Indigenous-led health study into the high incidence of rare cancers at Port Chipewyan. Place an immediate moratorium on any expansion of tar sands mining, such as new mines and extensions of existing projects. Ensure the federal government issues a Fishery Act Section 37(1) order to each tar sands operator to submit its environmental management system for review. In the near term, we demand you hold a public inquiry into the current state of impacts from tar sands operations and tailings ponds, include the human health, ecological, and economic impacts, as well as the structural integrity of all tailings ponds. Guarantee that current and future mitigation actions by industry and regulators must have free, prior, and informed consent of all impacted Indigenous nations. Ensure each tar sands operator has a comprehensive tailings reclamation plan that incorporates Western science and Indigenous knowledge, with a goal of fully remediating and reclaiming the tailings impoundments while preventing any release of toxins into the environment. These plans should be approved by affected Indigenous nations and be publicly accessible. Secure from tar sands operators adequate security deposits in trust accounts to implement tailings ponds cleanup plans and finance the environmental remediation of mine sites. Increase fines for violations of environmental regulations by tar sands companies. Ensure full public disclosure of the findings of the Alberta Information Commissioner's investigation into whether AER violated the law by failing to inform affected Indigenous nations, communities, and the public of the seepage from the Imperial Oil Kearl tar sands mining Tailings River watershed. Dismantle the Alberta Energy Regulator and develop an independent regulatory system in which the decision-making authority is shared with the impacted Indigenous nations. So we trust that you will give serious consideration to our concerns and work together to take appropriate action. So that was last May. Now, there was an investigation into Alberta Energy Regulator's handling of this whole issue. It was done by a big consulting company. Can't think of what it's the name of it at the moment. A name everybody will know. And they exonerated them in terms of obeying the law. It said that they had followed their procedures, even though that they had not informed the Indigenous communities. But, you know, they could do better. Like, they could improve communication and a few other things. It's worth reading, actually. And as a result of that, now that came out on September 27th, so that's just a few weeks ago, 2 to 3 weeks ago. And I'll read you the response to that. It's shorter. And as well, back in May or back in the spring after this happened, the Alberta Energy Regulator and Imperial Oil went and were called to the government of government of Canada, and I guess they spoke to committee and explained what was going on, and they were asked to return 6 months later, which is this month, and they refused to do so. They're not interested in letting the government know. And of course, the government of Canada does have certain jurisdictions over particularly water and fisheries and that sort of thing. So they refuse to do that. So finally, I will, before I give my very last remarks, I will just read this letter. Statement on the review of the Alberta Energy Regulator's response to Imperial Oil toxic tailings leak. Today, the Alberta Energy Regulator, AER, released the results of a review regarding its handling of the 2 incidents that occurred at Imperial Kearl oil sands mine earlier this year, resulting in over 5.3 million liters of toxic tailings spilling into the environment. The review concluded that the AER followed existing policies, standards, procedures, and/or processes, even though it did not notify Indigenous nations of the incident for 9 months, leaving them unaware of the risks of consuming water and harvesting the area. It is shocking the AER is refusing to admit any wrongdoing by hiding a massive toxic leak from impacted communities and the public. This is further evidence that AER is a captured body designed to protect industry, even if it means endangering the public. The Imperial Oil leak and cover-up were not a mistake. They were a direct result of the broken regulatory system in Alberta. It is appalling for the regulator to take no responsibility for such an egregious failure. We stand in full solidarity with Indigenous nations calling for a dismantling of AER. This review highlights the urgent need for the federal government to use the tools at its disposal to step up and address the issue of toxic tailings, said Eleanor Rougeau, Climate and Energy Program Manager at Environmental Defence Canada. So this was put out by Environmental Defence and Keepers of the Water. Now the first letter that I read was signed by quite a few different groups, including ourselves, the Edmonton chapter of the Council of Canadians. In finishing, this is an ongoing issue, and you know, we get involved in a lot of different issues, and the problem is that the issues don't go away, and it's easy to just move from one thing to another. We're going to try to keep on this one, and as well as getting involved in other issues. And if there's anybody here that you know, wants to work with us, just come to me, and we can at least keep you informed of what we're up to, because we need to solve this issue. Thank you.